So if you've already watched the video where we did this for Blender render materials, then you'll notice that this task is nearly the same when we're dealing with Cycles materials and the Cycles render engine, with maybe just a few minor caveats. But for consistency's sake, we're going to go ahead and cover this using Cycles materials. So let's go ahead and switch this to the Cycles render engine here. And I also want to cover maybe one or two topics that I feel are important that I may have missed in that video. So when we're talking about the UV map of objects, there's really two different ways to go about this. The first is to let our UV map just be auto-generated, which is great if you don't plan on editing that UV map in other software like Photoshop or GIMP or something like that. So for instance, if I were to double right click over here and under mesh, add a monkey head, maybe tap W a few times, give it some smoothing, S to scale it up just a little bit, and say I wanted to paint directly onto this monkey head, I could press T, and we can use ZeroBrush or ZeroBrush Lite if you're using the free version with Sensei format. We can press this texture paint button, and a UV map will be automatically generated for us. We can then immediately begin painting onto our object. We could also load a texture brush by clicking on Brush here. Currently I'm using the Seamless Elemental Brush Pack, which you can get at blendersensei.com. You can also download the free light version of these texture brushes there. And then of course you would just want to navigate to where that folder was on your computer to be able to access these. And I am looking at these in thumbnail view here as opposed to just list view. So that's why I'm seeing like this. And of course we'll be covering more of this in detail in future tutorials. But for now, say I were to double click and load one of these textures here, and I could just then begin to immediately paint onto this Suzanne head here. So if I planned on doing all my editing and painting right here in Blender and just wanted to paint all the layers onto my object, then letting ZeroBrush automatically generate the UV map would be fine. If we come down here and switch this to the UV image editor, we can actually see what this object's UV map that was automatically generated looks like here. And I'm going to go down here in my 3D view and hold Alt and tap middle mouse button to zoom in on the Suzanne head here. And I could also switch this image to the image that was generated from ZeroBrush for us called Sousa Color here. And so we can actually see the parts of the image behind this UV map. If you don't plan on editing this image in another program, then a UV map like this is fine. And more than fine, it's actually ideal because having the UV map laid out like this allows the faces of this UV map to be larger to use more of the image behind it. And what that boils down to is basically getting more bang for your buck when it comes to image resolution. However, if we wanted to edit this map in GIMP or Photoshop or something, it wouldn't be particularly useful because we don't really know where the nose is or the eyes are. I mean, we can figure that out. So I mean, I could press tab to go into edit mode here, press space for face selection. And if I just start selecting parts of this Suzanne mesh here, you can see as I do that, the corresponding part of the UV map shows up in the image editor here. So if I could click this face here, we see that this face is actually correspondent to this part of the UV map over this part of the image. So if I switch this to island selection here, which makes it easy to just grab a whole thing like that and press G to grab, notice as I move this bit of the UV map, we can see the corresponding relationship of this change here on the actual object. So if I press tab to go back into object mode, that's what that looks like. And I'll press Control Z a few times to undo that. Yeah, I mean, we could figure that out that way about where stuff is if we wanted to be able to edit this in Photoshop or GIMP or something, but it would be kind of a pain. So if I press tab to go back into object mode, here is our auto-generated UV map. Once again, this is great if you don't plan on editing this stuff in another program and you just want to be able to immediately paint on here. However, if we wanted to have more control over our UV map and maybe be able to edit it more easily in another program, we would want to first give Blender instructions about how to basically taxidermy up this object, how to lay flat all the faces so that it's more easily to edit them in another program. By comparison, let's go ahead and click on this object mode button, which sends us back into object mode. Let's press Shift A and add another monkey head and bring it over here. Tap W a few times, give it some smoothing, maybe scale it up a little bit. If we wanted a more cohesive UV map, one that would be easier to edit in another program, we can tell Blender how we want it to create that UV map using seams. So if I press Tab to go into edit mode and shift scroll up for edge selection here, we can select edges and then mark those edges as seams. And when we do, that gives Blender instructions about the lines in which we want Blender to taxidermy, cut up the skin of this 3D object and lay it all flat so that we can put images on it. So I'm going to press my edge button here where I have access to this mark seams here. What I'm going to do is hold Alt and click this edge here, which goes all the way around this Suzanne face here. If I press Z, you can see the line there a little better. And what I can do is press mark seams. And now that I've done that, this line becomes this kind of extra thick orange here. So now what I've done is I've informed Blender, hey, when I create this UV map, cut the face skin off like this and lay it out flat so it'll be easier for me to work with this UV map. So to get good at creating UV maps, you're just going to have to experiment with the different ways in which unwrapping things works. But typically, if you find large concentrations of faces and stuff, that's typically a good sign of an area you'll want to mark off, such as these ears here. So I'm going to click on this edge here, which deselects my previous selection, and then Alt-Shift select this loop here, which does a loop select, which selects an entire loop of edges here, and then Shift select that little edge there that didn't get loop selected because I want it selected there. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same for this other ear over here. I'm just going to hold Alt and then hold Shift, which will loop select but add to that selection, and then Shift select there. And so now I've got these two bits of the ears selected here, and I could go ahead and press mark seams. And now that's additional instructions to Blender about how I want these UV islands created. One thing to note here is that any part of the mesh that is not physically, for lack of better words, connected to the rest of the bulk of the mesh will automatically be given its own island of faces. So these eyes here, if we hold Control and middle mouse to zoom to do a precise zoom inside of this Suzanne head, notice that these eyes here aren't actually connected to the rest of the bulk of the mesh. So stuff like this in your mesh that's not actually, connected in the same way, like say these two faces or these faces up here, these are, connected. If I move one point here, they all get moved around. But anything that's not connected fully to the bulk of the mesh will get its own island automatically. So we don't have to worry about the eyes there. So now what we could do is press A to select everything, and either press U to bring up the unwrap menu to unwrap, or we can just press this button right here, which brings up that same menu, and just press unwrap there. So now, by comparison to this other UV map we created on this monkey head we were just painting, we can either directly switch this to the UV image editor, or since we're already dealing with this stuff, just press this Edit UVs button here. Now we can see the new map generated for this new object, which this new object is not using this Suzanne color image map here, but because this is the last image that we had open when we were working on the Suzanne head here, that's why it's showing up. But anyway, by comparison to the monkey head that we just let the UV map be auto-generated from, notice that this one actually has some form. We can actually see the face area that we marked off, and we can see the ears here that we marked off. And if I press my island selection button here, it makes it a lot easier to grab these big chunks. And then we can see both the eyes here, as I mentioned before, since they weren't connected to any bulk of the mesh, they got automatically turned into their own little UV map islands. If I were to press Tab to go back into object mode and click on this first monkey head, which down here in the camera view, you can't really see which objects you have selected or not, but I just clicked on it and it will select it. But if we press Tab to go back into edit mode and A to select all that, so here is the auto-generated UV map, which is great if we just plan on painting right here in Blender, because it gives us really good UV map distribution and it allows us to just immediately paint on the object, compared to the one we manually created with this new Suzanne head here where we marked off seams. One quick thing I want to mention, in general it's good to have some space between these UV map islands, because if these are too close, then you can occasionally have the problem of bleeding which means part of the image will show up on your object where it's not supposed to. Another problem we can sometimes have when dealing with UV maps and textures and stuff is that when we're painting, even though we may be directly painting onto a face, there may appear to be these kind of like white seams that are running through the object. Now that occasionally can be a problem, but a lot of times if you see white seams running through your object, like you can sort of see it right now. If we look back at this other Suzanne head here, the farther I zoom out away from this, you can see these kind of white seams pop up going through this part of the texture that we painted, but when we zoom in close on it, we don't see them anymore. While that can occasionally be a problem with your actual level of brush bleeding while you're texture painting, so if I switch this back to 3D view, press tab to go to object mode, click on this first monkey head, and click back on the texture paint button, under options here where it says project paint, you can actually control this bleed value, and that ensures that when you're painting on it, the paint goes a little bit past where it is on this UV map and goes a little bit outside of the lines to ensure that you don't get those kind of white seams showing up there. But I want to mention that a lot of times in Blender, those white seams are actually appearing as a bug within Blender's viewport MIP mapping. So MIP mapping is sort of texture smoothing that happens to blend the textures a little bit when we're at a farther distance away from them so they don't look so pixelated and bad. So if you've ever played like a PlayStation 1 game, PlayStation 1 did not have MIP mapping. So you would have a lot of times your 3D characters and stuff looks super pixelated on it. But your later systems, your N64 and your PlayStation 2 and up, started using MIP mapping so textures would look smooth. However, there is an issue in Blender that can make it appear as though there are these white ugly seams running through your objects when they're really not. So for instance, we can sort of see these white seams running on this monkey head back here, but if I were to render this out right now, that will not render that way. It's just a MIP mapping bug within Blender, which I have reported before to the Blender developers, and they say that there's really nothing that can be done about it. But notice that it's there here in the viewport, but if I were to render this, it is totally not there at all. So it's not there in the final rendered image. So I just want you to be aware, if you see those seams popping up through things, it's not your fault and it's not the software's fault. It's just sort of an issue that happens in the 3D viewport sometimes. So I apologize for that kind of long side road we just went down there. I just know that this issue annoyed me so bad for years until I finally figured out what was going on and that it wouldn't actually affect my renders. Okay, so let's press go back. Okay, so now we know the difference between automatically generated UV maps, such as this first one. So if I press tab to go back into edit mode and switch this to the Sousa color here. This is an auto-generated UV map, which is fine if you plan on just painting onto the object directly. And if I press tab to go back into object mode so I can select this other Suzanne head we did, this is one we made manually by marking seams, which would make it easier for us to edit this in other software and stuff. I'm going to go ahead and come down here and press this plus button to create a new image because I'm tired of looking at the one that's actually on this other Suzanne head over here. I know that can be a bit confusing because you click on one object and you think, oh, well, I'll just be looking at whatever images are associated with that object, but not always the case. You have to manually switch what image you're looking at. We'll just call this new monkey here, and instead of making this black, we'll make that white, press OK, and now it's got a new image associated with it. So here was the UV map that we marked all the seams for this, but there's a few things we should do to clean this UV map up before going forward. The first thing to note is that most of our detail that we would be putting into this Suzanne head is probably going to be going into this face. However, the UV map that controls this face here is using less than a quarter of this actual image. That means the part of the texture that will be where this face is will be using less than a quarter of the image resolution available, which is not good. Whereas this big bulk here, which this is basically everything that isn't that area of the ears that we marked off, or these eyes, or the face, this is just like all the rest of this back head here. So you can see if I hold C to do my circle select brush and just kind of paint over this area here, notice that all these faces are showing up over here because that's all this stuff. So I'll just press A to select all that again. The point is that there's probably not a lot of detail going to be going into the scalp and the sides and stuff like that. So we want most of the detail resolution available for the face. So what we would want to do is scale down this big bulk here, maybe move it over or something, and also maybe get things that are similar, such as these eyes, put them in an appropriate place. It makes it easier to edit the overall image later on, and just move these ears out of the way somewhere here. Now we can grab this island of faces for the face here. Once again, I'm using the island select here. Press S to scale this up and let this take a lot more of the image so we're not wasting all the rest of this map. So we could scale up something like this. And of course, you don't want any of these islands overlapping, because whatever part of the image is where this face is will end up being where the eyeball is, and that would not be good, obviously. So you'd want to move this stuff out of the way, such as these ears here. And you may want to go ahead and rotate some of this stuff just so it visually makes more sense if you're editing this UV map in another program. So we could press R to rotate this other side of the ear here, bring it over here near this other one, and we could, move these eyeballs out of the way here. And so you just want to position this stuff to where, you're able to get the most bang for your buck from the image resolution size that you're having to work with. So if you're, working on a video game asset, you're obviously going to want to really maximize this as much as you can, because you may be working with a really small image back here. A few more things we might consider. One area that there may or may not be much detail in, depending on whatever you plan on doing, is this mouth area here. But notice that the UVs of this map are really, really small. And once again, the smaller each UV face is over this image area, that's all the area that will be available to fit in detail over that part of the image. So if you knew like maybe your character was going to have like weird scars or something on its lips and you needed more detail, you could make sure and scale those areas to be larger. So what we could do is either shift scroll up to do UV edge selection here, or just select that button there, and alt select this loop of UV edges, then shift alt to select the rest of this. We could maybe scale this out a little bit. And select these two, move those up. Select these edges around here, around this mouth area here. I tried alt selecting them, but it didn't work real great, so we're just going to scale that up and scale this some. Maybe bring that down a little bit, scale this out a little bit here, and bring these down, maybe scale those a little bit. You also have available a bunch of different tools here under your UV items menu here. And if instead of all these different words down here, you see an icon that looks like this, just click on it. And of course that expands the actual list menu of stuff. So you've got tools here you might want to mess around with for adjusting your UV map. Additionally, you can enable proportional editing, which will, like, say you have one of these UV edges selected or just a single UV point there, and you were to press S to scale, you can then organically edit everything. So I would want to scroll my mouse wheel down to decrease the size that's being affected here, obviously, because that was way too much. It was the whole thing. But, there's those kind of options as well. So see how I'm sort of able to scale this whole thing down. So basically, you just want your UV map positioned in a way that makes sense to paint on it if you're going to like paint directly onto something like this face. And you want good distribution with things. You don't want anything overlapping something else, because that would be bad. Even maybe something like these eyes, we could shift scroll up for edge selection and scale these out, because these are really close. So when you have UV edges and faces that are too close to each other, it can sometimes produce issues in your final material of your object. I'll go ahead and disable proportional editing there, so I can just scale that single line and do the same thing for this other eye over here. You can see there's a little bit of bunching here on the rest of the scalp, but that shouldn't be too much of an issue because probably not a lot of detail going in those areas anyway. So right now we've made a pretty decent UV map for our monkey head here, but the monkey doesn't have a material or any image texture nodes to show up whatever would go on this image. And if we were being real ordered, we could go ahead and rename this UV map that we created here. We could just go ahead and change its name from UV map to new monkey UV, or whatever you wanted to call it there. But you can change its name there to reference it later and close that up. And also we could go ahead and create a material for this object here. So we could click Material, press New, and of course we're in the Cycles render engine, so this gives us a new basic default material here. So we could switch this over to the node editor here. We've got our nodes. Then all we would want to do is double right click and under texture, put an image texture node, connect that to the diffuse, which diffuse is just basic color. And right now there is no selected image, so it's just black because there's no info there. So we would just want to click this button here and select the new monkey basic image that we made a minute ago while we were working with this UV map. So now that's all connected. And so if you hadn't made a UV map for your object and you created a new material and added this image texture, you wouldn't see any of this. So your objects always have to have an existing UV map to be able to use the image textures or materials, whether in Cycles or Blender Render. But now if we switch this back to the image editor here, if we were to press T to bring up our tool shelf here and switch this from view to paint here, if you have the full version of ZeroBrush, you'll have access to your ZeroBrush brush menu options, which you can use to paint. Or if you just have ZeroBrush Lite, you can just use the default brush settings found in Blender under the options setting where it says tool, switch your brush here, or just tap space for your brush selection. So currently we're using this carpet brush here, and we could just, start texture painting straight from here in Blender. And of course you can see that show up on our object now where you would expect it to. Or we could switch this to the default draw brush here and just paint a regular color and what have you. But the real benefit of this, of course, would be to be able to edit what you were painting externally in another program such as Photoshop or GIMP or something. First of all, if we wanted to save our changes to this image we just edited, notice down here with this little asterisk by image, that means that the image you have currently been painting has not been saved, either packed into the blend file or saved somewhere to disk. And that means even if you were to save this file, press Save As and save it on your computer somewhere, if you opened it back up, the changes to this image would not show up because they're not saved. That's what the little asterisk means. So if you wanted to save your changes, you could go to Image and press Save As Image and then just, choose a location. Now, ideally, if you're working on a project or a file or something, you always want to save images associated with your object in a folder that is right next to that file. But just for demonstration purposes, we're just going to save this to my desktop, and we'll just call it newmonkey.png, and I'll press Save As Image there. And notice the asterisk goes away, and that means everything's safe now. If I were to save this file, then the changes to this image would show up. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file, Save As, and also save it in the same location that I saved that image on my desktop here, and just call it, since we called that image New Monkey, let's just call the file New Monkey also, and press Save As Blender File. So to be able to edit your UV mapped images on the fly in your favorite editing software, the way we do that is we set that up in the user preferences. So under File, User Preferences here, and I'll go ahead and put that into full screen. If we go under the File tab, there is an option here for Image Editor. And all you want to do is select the program on your computer you want to use. So if it's Photoshop, you want to select Photoshop. If it's GIMP or Krita, something like that, you would select that. So you just click this file icon, and you would have to find the location of that program. So for the version of Photoshop I have, so if I was on the C hard drive, I'd go to Program Files 86, Adobe, and then Adobe Photoshop, then just select Photoshop.exe, press Accept or whatever program, and then you'd be good to go. So whenever I'm done editing my user preferences, I usually like to switch it back to this interface tab because the last tab you left it on will be saved whenever you press Save User Settings. And that's just something I like to do to be consistent. So I go back to interface, press Save User Settings, and we can go ahead and X this window out. Now under this image menu here in the UV image editor, if you press this Edit Externally button, whenever you open up Blender, it will automatically open whatever image you happen to be working on in that program. So right now, if we press Image, Edit Externally, Photoshop will open up. So now Photoshop has opened up this image. I could do whatever crazy thing I want to it, and I just have some weird brush loaded here. I don't remember actually loading this brush, but whatever. And then if I were to press File and Save, and then back in Blender, just press reload image here. All those changes I just made in Photoshop now show up in Blender, which is awesome. One really important part about when you are doing this, so if I press edit externally again, and since Photoshop's already open, it already takes me straight back there. You have to make sure that when you save whatever file you're working on, that it doesn't save as a PSD. It needs to save as whatever type that Blender opened it up as. So this was a .png file. So when you go to File and Save or press Ctrl S, sometimes Photoshop will say, oh, do you want to save this as a PSD? And you're like, no, I want to save it as the same file type I opened it as. So just, make sure that that happens. Otherwise, when you reload the image, the changes won't show up. Okay, so if we're here in Blender, we have this nice UV map outline to work with. So wouldn't it be nice if we have that also working in Photoshop or Krita or whatever we're using? So we can do that. All we have to do is switch this from Paint back to View, so we have access to this UVs menu here, and open that up. Then you would want to press Export UV Layout, and you would want to save this in the same location with your other files and projects or the stuff you were working on. And so we could call this New Monkey UV map there. .png would be fine. Press Export UV Layout. And now back in Photoshop or whatever we're using, assuming you have the ability to use layers in your program, you just want to go to File, Place, or whatever it is to put a new image as a layer in your program or whatever, and click on that UV map, press Place, and just go ahead and confirm that. Now we have this nice layer here to use as a guide. So notice when we put these, when I brushed all these weird, whatever weird brush I had loaded here in Photoshop, notice that some of these areas like went into where the UV map of the eyes would go or the side of the head, which wouldn't make any sense. So, we would want to come back down here, maybe switch my brush to something normal and switch this to white here. Make sure nothing was overlapping that wasn't supposed to, or, maybe you wanted to add some kind of effect or something to your image. Whatever you wanted to do, you could. Then you would just want to make sure you hide that layer when you save this out, or else this UV map image thing will show up on your actual object, like when it's rendering and stuff, which you might want, but you probably don't want. So we could just hide that, and we could press either Ctrl S or File, Save. Notice that this time when I do this, since we added another layer, it's like, oh, don't you want to save it as a PSD? And you're like, no, I still want to save it as a PNG. You can't save this as a PSD because if you do, Blender won't be able to load that same image it's working with back into it. So you just want to make sure that this is saving out as the same file type as you opened it up as. Press Save. Yes, replace it. Okay. And you should only have to deal with that once after you tell Photoshop, hey, I want to save this as a PNG. And then back in Blender, under Image, we can press Reload Image here. And we've got that image on our object. Notice the glass filter effect we added in Photoshop there. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this back to the 3D view. Press Tab to go back into object mode. So here's our mapped image texture on this Suzanne head. Of course, we could go to the node editor. We could add all kinds of different fancy nodes and shaders and things to this and do all sorts of interesting things. So I hope this video has helped you learn the basics of UV mapping, editing, and exporting your UV maps and images externally in other programs. Thanks for watching, and stick around for more.